Dawn, in the late summer of 1940. On a scarred airfield in Kent, a ground crew drags the burnt-out shell of a Spitfire across the wet grass. By the end of the week, a factory will have built its replacement. The 19-year-old who was flying it is another matter. A Spitfire took roughly 13,000 man-hours to build. A pilot took nearly a year. And over the skies of southern England, the Royal Air Force was losing them faster than it could make them. During the Battle of Britain, fighter commands suffered heavy pilot casualties while trained replacements remained desperately difficult to produce. Every experienced airman lost was far harder to replace than the aircraft he flew. The factories could replace a burned-out Hurricane in days. Nothing on the island could replace the man who had been sitting in it. This was the cold arithmetic of aerial warfare. Aircraft were machinery. Aircrew were the bottleneck. And by 1940, Britain's ability to expand and sustain the flow of trained aircrew was buckling under conditions no training system could have sustained. Every flying school competed for the same crowded airspace as operational squadrons scrambling to intercept raids. Every training aircraft burned fuel the island needed for combat. The weather closed in for weeks at a time, and a student pilot on a navigation exercise over Kent could find himself sharing the sky with a Messerschmitt. You cannot teach a 19-year-old to fly in a war zone, but the war zone was everywhere. Months before the Battle of Britain proved how desperate the shortage would become, planners in London were already studying a map, searching for limitless airspace, open land, clear weather, and an entire ocean between the classroom and the Luftwaffe. Their eyes settled on a country with roughly the population of Greater London, spread across the second-largest landmass on Earth, and an air force still small by European standards, with only a few thousand personnel. Canada, the idea was staggering in its simplicity and absurd in its scale. Move the training apparatus of an empire across the Atlantic, build it from nothing, and do it before the losses over Europe became unrecoverable. The only question was how. The negotiations began before the Battle of Britain was even imaginable. In October 1939, barely a month into the war, a British delegation led by Lord Riverdale arrived in Ottawa carrying a proposal so large that Canada's Prime Minister, William Lyon Mackenzie King, initially treated it with suspicion. Britain wanted Canada to become the principal training base of the British Commonwealth Air Training Plan, not simply another contributor, but the center of the entire system. Early negotiations quickly became tense as questions of cost, control, and Canada's role within the Commonwealth surfaced. Mackenzie King was determined that Canada would participate as a partner rather than simply carry out British expectations. Canada was a nation of 11 million people. Its air force remained modest by European standards, with only a few thousand personnel and a small fleet of mostly aging aircraft, and the projected cost of the scheme was enormous by Canadian standards, demanding one of the largest financial commitments in the country's history. Yet King saw something in the proposal that suited him precisely. A massive training commitment might allow Canada to make its greatest contribution in the air rather than through another generation bled into the trenches. The memory of the Somme and Passchendaele hung over every calculation in Ottawa. Training airmen at home, King reasoned, could be Canada's war. So he bargained hard, and after 2 months of wrangling, he won his terms. On December 17, 1939, his own 65th birthday, Mackenzie King signed the British Commonwealth Air Training Plan Agreement. Canada would host and administer the scheme, absorbing the largest share of the cost. Australia and New Zealand would send trainees and money. Britain would provide aircraft and a cadre of experienced staff. King also secured important recognition of Canada's authority over administering the plan, reinforcing that the program would operate as a Commonwealth partnership rather than simply a British undertaking. This was not a colony taking orders. It was a Dominion setting terms. The pipeline was a Commonwealth machine. Canada was its engine room, not its owner. Then the planners in Ottawa unrolled the blueprint and the celebration stopped. The original agreement called for 74 schools and units. During the war, that expanded into more than 100 training schools operating across more than 200 stations and relief fields throughout Canada. Elementary flying schools to teach basic airmanship, service flying schools for advanced training, schools for navigators, bomb aimers, wireless operators, and air gunners. Each one needed runways, hangars, barracks, classrooms, water systems, sewage, electricity, and heating capable of surviving a prairie winter. The scheme demanded thousands of training aircraft, tens of thousands of ground crew, and a target output climbing toward more than 1,400 aircrew graduates every single month. Set that ambition against what actually existed in Canada in December 1939, and the numbers become almost comical. The Royal Canadian Air Force had fewer pilots in uniform than the plan intended to graduate in a matter of weeks. Qualified flying instructors were in short supply, prompting the RCAF to recruit experienced civilian pilots, many of whom were later trained and integrated into the instructional system, including many bush pilots and commercial aviators familiar with Canada's demanding flying conditions. Many of the designated school sites were not airfields at all. They were farmland, wheat stubble and fence lines where the blueprint showed triangular runway patterns and rows of hangars, and the deadline was merciless. The first schools were expected to open within months, with the full system running at capacity by 1942. Every week of delay in Canada risked slowing the flow of trained aircrew desperately needed overseas. The agreement made headlines across the Commonwealth, praised in Parliament, and celebrated in the press as a decisive act of empire cooperation. But in the offices of the RCAF, the men responsible for delivering it understood the truth behind the signatures. They had been handed a promise the size of a continent, backed by an air force the size of a small town. The paper empire existed. The real one did not. No paved runways, no buildings, almost no instructors, and a war that was about to get catastrophically worse. Someone had to turn a signature into an aviation empire, and they had less than a year to do it. Air Commodore Robert Leckie, serving on loan from the Royal Air Force, was among the senior officers responsible for developing the BCAP's training organization, working alongside RCAF leaders, engineers, administrators, and civil authorities as Canada built an aviation network unlike anything it had attempted before. Together, their solution was ruthless in its practicality. They would not design bespoke airfields. They would stamp a pattern across the country like a printing press. A standard layout emerged, 3 runways arranged in a triangle, so that a student could always land roughly into the wind, no matter which way it blew across the flat prairie. Hangars along one side, H-shaped barracks, blocks behind them. The same drawings, repeated from Vancouver Island to Prince Edward Island. Then Canada started building at a pace the country had never seen. Survey crews walked wheat fields in the winter of 1939 and 1940, driving stakes into frozen ground. Behind them came thousands of workers with graders and gravel trucks, laboring through spring mud to lay runways where crops had stood the previous autumn. Contractors moved entire buildings. In many locations, farmland was transformed into operational training stations within remarkably short periods of time. By the spring of 1940, the first intakes of trainees were arriving at the plan's opening schools less than 5 months after the agreement was signed. The remarkable thing was how Canadians reacted to the disruption. Across the prairies, towns did not resist the bulldozers. They fought for them. Local boards of trade and town councils flooded Ottawa with petitions, each community lobbying to have an airfield built on its doorstep. The Depression had hollowed out these towns for a decade. An air training school meant construction jobs, contracts, and hundreds of young men with pay in their pockets. Mayors wrote letters listing their region's flying weather like a sales brochure. For a farmer outside Weyburn or Dauphin, watching surveyors turn the horizon into geometry, the war had arrived not as a threat, but as an economy. Then, in May and June of 1940, the plan's entire premise detonated. France collapsed. Britain stood alone. And suddenly, the training scheme designed for a long, patient war had to sprint. Schools scheduled for 1942 were dragged forward by more than a year. Britain, its own airspace now a battlefield, began transferring entire RAF training schools across the Atlantic, staff and aircraft together, folding them into the Canadian system. And then the trainees themselves began to arrive, and small-town Canada met the Commonwealth face to face. Troopships and trains delivered young men from Australia, New Zealand, Britain, and beyond into railway stations on the open prairie. Australians in dark blue uniforms stepped onto platforms in Saskatchewan towns of 2,000 people. New Zealanders billeted near schools in Manitoba wrote home about a landscape so flat and vast it frightened them. Local families invited homesick trainees to Sunday dinners. Dance halls that had been half empty since 1930 were suddenly full every Saturday night. The scheme was reshaping not just Canadian geography, but Canadian life. By the end of 1940, dozens of schools were operating, with dozens more under construction on the way to a nationwide network of flying schools, specialist training centers, relief fields, and support facilities stretching across every province. Yellow-painted tiger moths and fleet finches buzzed over towns that had never seen an aircraft up close. Against every reasonable prediction, the printing press method had worked. The empire of runways was rising out of the wheat, but the planners had built their miracle in spring and summer. Now, the days were shortening. The first hard frosts crept across the prairies, and behind them came something no one in London had fully priced into the blueprint: a Canadian winter, with temperatures that could crack engine blocks, bury runways overnight, and erase the horizon itself. The schools were built. Now they had to survive January. The sound arrived before the aircraft did. The North American Harvard, the plan's advanced trainer, had a propeller whose tips approached the speed of sound at full throttle, producing a distinctive snarling rasp that could be heard for miles. For farm families living beside the service flying schools, that sound became the background noise of the war years. For the trainees, it was the sound of graduation day approaching and of the gap they had to cross to reach it, because the machines themselves told the story of that gap. A student began on a tiger moth or a fleet finch, a gentle biplane with an open cockpit and a landing speed slower than a car on a highway. 8 to 10 weeks later, if he survived selection, he climbed into the Harvard, 600 horsepower, a retractable undercarriage, a machine deliberately chosen because it was demanding enough to punish carelessness the way a fighter would. Students streaming toward bombers moved instead to the twin-engined Avro Anson, the docile Faithful Annie, used to train future navigators, wireless operators, bomb aimers, and multi-engine pilots in the skills they would later bring together in operational crews overseas. Each type was a rung on a ladder, and every rung could kill. The accidents came from everywhere. A moment's hesitation on takeoff with the torque of the Harvard's engine. 2 aircraft converging in a crowded circuit above a busy school. A night navigation exercise that drifted off track over darkened prairie with no lights to steer by. Mid-air collisions, stalls on the landing turn, engines failing over frozen lakes. The plan's leaders had accepted from the beginning that training at this scale and speed would cost lives. What no press release dwelt on was how many. By the end of the war, training accidents in Canada had claimed hundreds of aircrew and instructors. Many of those young men are buried in cemeteries beside the towns that hosted them. Young men from Auckland and Sydney and London lying under prairie headstones, casualties of a war they never reached. Sometimes the courage the plan was built to produce revealed itself before graduation. On November 10, 1941, near Calgary, a training aircraft from No. 2 Wireless School crashed and caught fire. On board was Carl Gravel, a 19-year-old leading aircraftman training as a wireless operator air gunner. Thrown from the wreck, burned and with one eye destroyed, Gravel did not run from the flames. He turned back into them to try to pull his pilot out. He later died from his injuries and was posthumously awarded the George Cross for his extraordinary courage. He had never flown an operational mission. He never would. The pipeline's cost was paid in men like him long before the Luftwaffe ever entered the equation. And behind every one of those aircraft stood the men fighting a different enemy entirely, the thermometer. Prairie winters routinely dropped to -30 and -40 degrees. At those temperatures, ordinary engine oil turned to sludge, rubber turned brittle, and bare skin froze to metal on contact. Ground crew learned to drain the oil from engines at night and keep it warm indoors, or to dilute it with fuel so it would flow at dawn. They dragged canvas shrouds over engine cowlings and pumped heated air underneath from portable heaters, working through the small hours so the morning's flying could begin on schedule. Mechanics were called working on engines in the open, with their hands going numb in minutes, forced to retreat, thaw their fingers, and return, because the training syllabus did not pause for weather. Snowplows and packing rollers worked the runways through the night after every storm. In some schools, aircraft were fitted with skis. The sky itself became an instructor, and a treacherous one. Winter haze and blowing snow could merge the white ground and white sky into a single blank sheet, stripping a student of any horizon. Many pilots compared the experience to flying inside a milk bottle. A trainee caught in whiteout conditions had to trust his instruments completely at a stage of training when instinct still screamed louder than the gauges. Some did not manage it, yet the planners understood something grim and valuable. A pilot who learned to handle a Canadian February could handle the night skies over Germany. The brutal environment was not just an obstacle to the training. In a hard, unintended way, it was part of the training. Through it all, the machine kept turning. Every few weeks, at schools across the country, another class formed up on a windswept parade square. An officer moved down the line, pressing wings onto tunics, the pilot's flying badge, the navigator's single wing, the air gunner's brevet. Behind each set of wings stood roughly a year of selection, classrooms, circuits, cross-country flights, night landings, and funerals for classmates. The graduates were, on average, about 20 years old. They had beaten the Harvard, the Winter, and the odds. But their reward was not safety. It was a troopship. Ahead of them lay the U-boat-threatened North Atlantic, where U-boat wolfpacks were sinking Allied vessels by the hundreds of thousands of tons, and beyond that, an air war whose casualty rates made the training losses look merciful. Canada had built them into Aircrew. Now it had to deliver them across 3,000 miles of hostile ocean into one of the most dangerous sustained air campaigns of the Second World War. And the question that had haunted London since 1940 still had no answer. Would there be enough of them, arriving fast enough to matter? They crossed the U-boat, threatened Atlantic aboard troopships and fastliners such as the Queen Elizabeth. Some sailed independently because of their speed, while many others crossed in escorted convoys through waters where the Battle of the Atlantic was reaching its most murderous phase. And on the far shore, the arithmetic that had terrified London in 1940 began slowly to invert. Consider what the air war over Europe was consuming. Bomber Command's campaign against Germany was, by 1943, suffering losses that would have broken any air force dependent on its own domestic training. On single nights over the Ruhr, dozens of bombers failed to return, each one taking 7 trained men with it. Over the entire war, Bomber Command lost more than 55,000 aircrew killed. An operational tour of 30 missions carried extraordinarily high risks, and many crews understood that completing one was far from guaranteed. The scale of these losses demanded a replacement system unlike anything the Commonwealth had attempted before. By 1943, the Canadian training system had reached a level of output unmatched earlier in the war, and it continued operating at an exceptionally high level into 1944, producing more than 3,000 trained aircrew each month at its wartime peak. One of those graduates was a quiet former furrier's assistant from Winnipeg named Andrew Mynarski. He had passed through the pipeline like tens of thousands of others, wireless training, then gunnery school at McDonald, Manitoba. Then the troopship, then a posting as a mid-upper gunner with 419 Squadron, RCAF. One of the Canadian bomber squadrons formed as the Royal Canadian Air Force gradually expanded its presence within Bomber Command. By 1944, the squadron was flying Lancasters with the RCAF's No. 6 group from the hills of Yorkshire. On the night of June 12, 1944, his bomber was shot down in flames near Cambrai. As the aircraft fell, Mynarski saw his tail gunner trapped in the rear turret. He crawled through burning hydraulic fluid to reach him, hacking at the jammed turret while his own clothing and parachute caught fire. He could not free him. Ordered away by the trapped man himself, Mynarski jumped, burning, and died of his injuries. The tail gunner, against all odds, survived the crash and lived to tell the story that won Mynarski a posthumous Victoria Cross. The prairie training fields had not just produced numbers, they had produced men like this by the tens of thousands and delivered them into the heart of the air war. The full scale becomes clear only when the ledger is totaled. From 1940 to 1945, the British Commonwealth Air Training Plan graduated more than 131,000 Commonwealth aircrew across every major flying trade. That figure counts every trade the bombers and fighters needed. Just under 50,000 pilots, alongside tens of thousands of navigators, bomb aimers, wireless operators, air gunners, and flight engineers. Roughly 72,000 of them were Canadian. The rest wore the uniforms of Britain, Australia, and New Zealand, with smaller contingents from across the Allied world. A remarkable proportion of the Commonwealth's wartime aircrew earned their qualifications under Canadian skies through the British Commonwealth Air Training Plan. The effect on the air war was structural. The Luftwaffe, by contrast, was caught in a death spiral of its own making. As Germany's losses mounted and fuel shortages became increasingly severe, especially during the final years of the war, pilot training hours were repeatedly reduced, sending increasingly inexperienced pilots into combat against Allied aircrew, who had generally received far more extensive training. Every month, the average Allied aircrew grew better trained, while the average German one grew greener. The BCAP did not achieve this alone. American training programs of comparable scale, Allied factories outbuilding the Axis, long-range escort fighters, and hard-won tactical lessons all bent the curve. But the Commonwealth's share of that curve ran through Canada. The question British planners had begun asking in late 1939 whether trained aircrew could be produced as reliably as aircraft had been answered on the Canadian prairies. Britain's aircrew replacement system never collapsed because far beyond the Luftwaffe's reach, Canada's training pipeline continued supplying the Commonwealth with trained aircrew. By the spring of 1945, the Allies had achieved overwhelming air superiority over Germany, and the Luftwaffe could rarely mount an effective challenge. The empty cockpits had been filled, year after year, by a country whose pre-war air force had been small, but whose wartime training system grew into one of the largest the Commonwealth had ever built. Then the war ended, and almost overnight, the aviation empire that had helped win it simply stopped leaving a question Canada has been quietly answering ever since. In 1943, President Franklin Roosevelt sent a message to Prime Minister Mackenzie King praising Canada as the aerodrome of democracy. The phrase became famous, quoted in speeches, and carved into memory as America's tribute to the training plan. Historians generally agree that the famous message was drafted within the Canadian legation in Washington with future Prime Minister Lester B. Pearson playing a key role in its preparation before it was issued over President Roosevelt's signature. It hardly mattered. The description was accurate, whoever held the pen. Because remember the problem this story opened with. In 1940, Britain could build fighters faster than it could build the men to fly them. One of the greatest bottlenecks in the Allied air war was trained aircrew. What Canada built between 1939 and 1945 was not an air force and not a fleet of aircraft. It was a solution to that bottleneck, a system capable of replacing trained aircrew on a scale the Commonwealth had never achieved before. The system vanished almost as fast as it appeared. Within months of victory, the schools closed, surplus aircraft were dispersed, and thousands of Commonwealth personnel returned home. But the plan left its skeleton behind. Drive the back roads of Saskatchewan, Alberta, or Manitoba today, and you will find it. Cracked triangles of runway in the middle of wheat fields, a leaning hangar full of a farmer's machinery, small cemeteries where young men from 3 continents lie under prairie sky. Some of the airfields became regional airports, most simply returned to the silence they were carved from. Stand on one of those broken runways on a winter morning in the cold that once froze mechanics' hands to their tools, and the equation completes itself. Part of the Allied victory in the skies over Europe began here in the vast, cold Canadian skies where thousands of Commonwealth aircrew first learned to fly.